أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Peace and blessings be upon you all dear viewers. Welcome to another episode of Revert's World on Ahlul Bayt TV, the only channel which is broadcasting the pristine teachings of the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam exclusively in the language of English. And today we have for you a dear friend of ours, a dear guest. His name is Joao, Jordao, and he has come to share his experiences of his life so far, prior to obviously to Islam, and the motivation behind his research into Islam, and then obviously his subsequent conversion and his experiences thereafter. First of all, I'd like to welcome you to the show and thank you for coming. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you. Alaikum salam.
Thank you very much. Brother Joao, if we could start, because obviously I know you are from a Portuguese background, so if we could go back to Portugal, the place of your birth, the place of your upbringing, and basically start from where you were born, where you grew up, your kind of family setting, so on and so forth.
Alright, I was born in north of Portugal, in a city called Guimarães. It's not a big city, it's not a small town, but everybody kind of knows each other. Back in the day they did. I guess my dad's family is quite prominent. My mom's from an American background, so she's an artist as well, and basically I was born in Guimarães, and so far as religion goes, I was baptized as, I would say 90% to, 99% at the time of children would have been. But basically my parents did this to please my grandparents, because it's something that's really important for your grandparents to attend a child's
Baptism.
Child's baptism is really important. After, we have something else which I didn't do, which is first communion, primeira comunhão we call it, first communion, something which I didn't do, which is naughty of me, but I was a child, it wasn't my choice. But basically, so my parents baptized me to please my grandparents, but they weren't very religious in themselves, so I was never brought up in a religious manner.
Right.
When at 6 years old, I moved to Lisbon. And this would have been in the beginning of the 90s. At this point, what happened, at least the way I remember it, is I would have been in the receiving end of a lot of hardcore atheism. Because basically, in the 80s and 90s, you had a huge backlash, and mainly intellectual backlash, against, and this is how people phrase it, religion as a whole. Even though it's quite silly, because religion means belief, so obviously there isn't going to ever be a real backlash against belief, because the backlash itself will be informed by a sort of belief. Basically, meaning that I was very, very atheist as a child, and I was a very articulate child, and so I was really aggressive, really aggressive, I think quite notoriously so. I was quite known for that. Really articulate in terms of my so-called atheist beliefs, which I guess were my way of repackaging whatever I would hear in my surroundings, and it would basically amount to a general critique of anything to do with religion, perhaps from a perception that religious institutions sometimes overstep the line, and so that was pretty much the story of my religious life. It was pretty monochrome.
What do you think the reason is? Because I know this isn't just exclusively a phenomenon in Portugal, but if you look at many of the Central European countries like Spain and even France, Italy, especially these countries that have quite a strong Catholic heritage, you tend to find nowadays that not only are people less religious, but there's almost like this, how can I call it, it's a field day now for anybody who wants to criticize religion, and you can criticize religion using the most profane language. What would you put this down to?
Yeah, something that I thought, quite recently, a couple of days ago, to show an example, there was a man, a writer, I'm sure he's a good writer and everything, called Jordao. He's a Portuguese man, passed away, gets celebrated like an absolute hero. He spent most of his life saying that Portugal shouldn't even be an independent country. Absolutely incredible. But point being, that this man basically made a lot of career out of making what some people call illuminated philosophy, illuminated writings. What this means is that I think, like in Europe, I think because of that backlash that there was, I guess, against the Catholic Church mainly, I think the situation now turned on, and it became so that any person that comes forward and attacks any religious figure is seen as being naturally subversive, and subversive in regards to these supposedly tyrannical, narrow-minded religious forces. The real problem with this is that there was a real amalgamation of everything religious.
Okay.
And this is quite important to say as well, and this is something that my mom brought to my attention really, really clearly. She said, you shouldn't give, she didn't say this, I'm paraphrasing it, but what she told me when I was young, when I was an adolescent, she said, if you come to the conclusion, if you come to the conscious conclusion that these so-called religious institutions, let's say, a certain Catholic priest, the Pope, whatever, if a certain religious authority has a message or an attitude that is not to their liking, then you should limit the power they have over you. And one of the best ways to do that is to not let their incompetence fuel, because that's what we're talking about at the end of the day. If we're speaking about a religious authority which is not, let's say, declaring the glory of God in an honest and authentic manner, then we're dealing with incompetence, because we're dealing with a priest. He has a very particular job. And in the face of that incompetence, I think this is what my mom said, something that I've been thinking about quite a lot, is you shouldn't give them the power to ruin the word of Jesus, for example, in the process. That is giving them more power than their incompetence deserves. And this is something that I've started coming into terms, and this is really true. It's a shame that because of there is incompetence, there is tyrannical behavior on the part of many, not just in the Catholic Church. But the point is, we shouldn't let them not only make a mockery sometimes of religion, we shouldn't on top of that let them kind of alienate us from whatever it is that is good, whatever it is that is best, the ideas that are best, the books that are best. And this is something that I think Europe in particular, and North America perhaps, has to come to terms with, is that rebellion there's a narrow path that you must take in order for any kind of rebellion to have any kind of productivity. If you're just going to amalgamate everything religious, you're going to get something extremely incoherent, which is, I think, what we see today. I think anything that is against religion, and the word religion, mind you, gets used in a really negative manner. Nowadays, I think there's even a case where religion or religious can be used as an insult. To say that something is religious in nature is bad, it is narrow-minded, it is limited.
It's dogmatic.
It's dogmatic because it doesn't change, therefore, by definition. It doesn't keep up with the changing of times, and therefore it is incorrect by nature. It sounds good at first, but it doesn't work out. It doesn't work out at all. Anything that works, anything that's functional is dogmatic in principle.
This advice that your mother gave you sounds like very sound advice, obviously, because we can relate to what your mother was saying. We hear all the time people saying, don't try and understand Islam necessarily by looking at the behavior of Muslims, bad Muslims at that. So it's a sound advice. But what I'm trying to understand here is you were saying that your parents were quite liberal. They weren't. The impression I got was they weren't quite religious yet. What she was saying sounds like a religious person.
Absolutely. I think my mother came into contact with Islam very early on because she ended up being an artist, but she majored in history. So I think she spent a lot of time early on preaching for tolerance, in particular regards to Islam. So maybe that's one of the reasons. Also, my mom just really, really quite fond of philosophy in general. So when you have an attitude from, let's say, a child that you see perhaps is gifted or talented, all that talent can come for nothing if you have an attitude which will basically block you from coming into contact with that which is good. So obviously her rationale must have been, well, there's no reason why you should keep yourself away from what essentially is the richest source of philosophy and ideas. And this is very easy to prove. Monotheistic religion is pretty much the source of most folklore, most art,
yes,
most writings. And so I think her point of view is keep away from attitudes and thoughts which will limit you and will limit your possibilities. And that's where the liberal mindset, like perhaps a very particular interesting side of some people's liberal mindset, which is on one part, yes, it might be dismissive of certain practices and ways, but at the same time it does have that point of view which says, yes, you should try and get the best that is out there. You know, you should try and be exposed to variety. And so it's quite natural. I think the two follow on quite naturally from a liberal upbringing, which told me to go out and search what's best, and search what makes more sense, and search what has more quality at the end of the day. And this is a really important message, which I think prepared me for coming into contact with not just Islam, any religion. I think it's the message that says, when you come into contact with something, don't just try and deliberate and think whether you agree with it or not. Try to identify within it some kind of quality. And if you see quality, if you see eloquence in it, then you have to research it further. You can't just ignore that all at once. And what many people are doing nowadays is just ignore it all at once. But what they don't realize is that they ignore it in a way which is dogmatic in itself, which has a very particular ideas, and unfortunately it's ideas which don't seem to be very productive, don't seem to open the way for compassion, don't seem to open the way for true philosophical search, and that's a shame. That has to be considered a shame.
Unfortunately. You mentioned earlier on how you were an atheist.
Yeah.
How, I guess what I'm asking is, what was your belief system as an atheist?
I think,
if you were to write down, I don't know, on a sheet of paper, 10 things, I'm not necessarily, let's say 5 things or 3 things that you would adhere to wholeheartedly, what would they be?
I think they would be, they would have been probably, I mean, mind you, like I said, it spills over into a religious belief in that you will say, okay, I'm an atheist, I don't believe in God. But mainly, I mean, my ideas would have been in regards to mankind. I wouldn't have spoken about religion in itself, because I mean, religion itself is mainly about belief, the nature of things outside of the human world. So my angle would have been, and a lot of atheists you'll find, I found the same, their angle would generally be, without wanting to be overly negative myself, would generally be, I think, like a kind of cynical critique of mankind as applies to religion. So if you asked me about my religious beliefs back then, I would have told you that, I would have probably said a couple of cynical things about human beings being greedy in nature, like a couple of cliches like that I would have probably thrown around. I would have probably told you that, something like we need to be free and independent in our thoughts, and therefore we shouldn't have anyone else tell us what to think, something along the lines of that. The problem is that I said that because I was told to, in a way, because I wasn't really doing anything else than articulating kind of prefixed ideas. I mean, when I say that you shouldn't believe anything just because someone else tells you, makes sense, but in itself it's a sentence that's been passed on to me.
Yes.
Obviously Islamically now, I believe that we do not have the power of creation, so I won't see it negatively because it was passed on to me. I'll see it negatively because it was passed on to me, but I didn't really think, I didn't really give enough thought into the essence of the words and what they meant, and most particularly how they made me behave and how they made me think, because there's a functional aspect to all of this. Anything that you will think will have a deep impact on how you treat other people, how you see the world in general. And I think if you see people in general, if you see anyone with power, with political power, with ideological power, as being a tyrant in essence, because they're telling everybody else what to think, and everyone else who is seen as following as being inherently stupid, I think this creates for a very unhealthy, unwholesome, dysfunctional approach to mankind, and thereafter, of course, to yourself.
It's funny though, but this belief that everybody should be free to think what they want, I mean, within certain boundaries, of course, even what you would be saying there, I'm not really sure that contradicts Islam. Because for us to believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the concept of God, the concept of prophethood, the day of judgment, etc., you can't be dictated to how to believe. This is something that each and every one of us has to believe for ourselves. So
absolutely not. I mean, that's exactly what I mean, is the critique that I carried already carries so many assumptions about everything else. And one of the negative things is because it makes you take on board this arrogant view that precisely because you say you are independent, you are a free thinker and independently minded, that you are so, and that therefore anyone else who has any name tag that can possibly be given to them is by definition narrow-mindedness. Just like I said before, I mean, any kind of functional process will usually be based in some kind of dogma, some kind of scheme. Similar with Islam. I mean, Islam does have a very basic framework which you can use in your own way. Obviously, you have to take it somewhere. You have to take it somewhere for yourself. You have to read the Quran yourself, hopefully if you're literate. You have to think about issues for yourself. And this is something that people really struggle to understand.
Yes.
Is that it is a scheme that actually works. Just like philosophy, for example, people can say that philosophy, the basis of philosophy is to be 100% open-minded. This is not true. Philosophy, in essence, is actual dogma. It's an idea of how to use questions in a particular way so as to get to sound knowledge. So is the scientific method. The scientific method, people say, is all about innovation, all about freeing your mind. It is not. It is completely the opposite. It's about dealing to very precise concepts because you've gained perhaps a sense of trust in regards to these methodologies to get you to where you want to be. Similarly with Islam. It is not, I think, well, it would be silly to say it is nothing because it would not exist. It is something, and it is good because it works. Because if you apply it, it gets you not only certain opinions and ideas, but mainly it gets an understanding of the world, which you will see to be true. Well, I've seen it to be true at least. Mainly because it gravitates around God. It does not gravitate around mankind, and for that reason is much more useful for people, quite paradoxically.
Yeah. What do you think about the idea? I mean, you've mentioned it already, but how much weight would you give to the idea? Again, just to round up with regards to the decline of religion in well, not just in Central Europe, but there specifically, because obviously that's where you spent the first years of your life. How much weight would you give to the argument that religion is on the decline because of the institutions and maybe some of the corruption of the institutions? Or would you say it goes a lot further than that?
I mean, I think it goes further than that in that, yes, on one side, there's the incompetence of, I mean, yeah, I mean, you can see the incompetence. The Catholic Church gave a huge blow to, let's call it the ability of intellectuals to put themselves out there as believing in God without being ridiculed, and without being accused of perhaps perpetrating or being, therefore, by definition, with agreeing with some of the actions of any given religious institution. On the other hand, perhaps, like I said, when you replace the belief in God or any other religious structure, when you replace it with atheism, you have to replace it with very precise ideas. They might be ideas which make whoever carries them to believe that they are free, that they're independent-minded, but you still need to carry those ideas, those very precise concepts. And so the flip side of it is you have institutions which also spread those, there are institutions which spread atheism, you know? There are institutions, and they do it, unfortunately, they've been doing it quite competently, but I think that increasingly, more and more people are not so much rejecting atheism as such, straight up, because we're not necessarily given the philosophical tools in school, and unfortunately not always in our family, to take that trip by ourselves. But I think a lot of people are starting to become disillusioned with atheism, because I think more and more thinkers are saying that, well, they're realizing that they're getting to the very basic concept that you need belief. That you need to believe to do anything.
Yes.
To have any particular movement, you need to know where you're going.
Of course. What about, what was the catalyst for you to then move away? I mean, you've very articulately criticized the atheist ideology, if you like, in a very general manner. But for you personally, what was it that made you decide, well, actually, I'm going to reject atheism?
I think it was a lot. It was very linked to, again, like, because atheism was very human for me, if you want. It really gravitated around concepts about mankind. It was somewhat political, I guess, and how people treat each other. But I think I didn't really realize the scope of the importance of the topic I was dealing with, really. I mean, when talking about religion, you need to kind of feed from a lot of different sectors, a lot of different fields of knowledge, and I think I was thinking too much about kind of, again, cynical, negative aspects of how people treat each other, again, religious institutions. But I think it was when I went to school and started having more depth in my studies, I came into contact with I mean, especially chemistry, which kind of changed my perspective of the world, because chemistry essentially studies material parts at their most basic. And so I think maybe a couple of ideas that my mother must have put across to me, but essentially I started thinking about functionality. For me, religion has a lot to do with functionality, what works, what doesn't work. And studying science, obviously one gets the feeling that things are inherently functional. What I mean by that is, for example, when I was studying chemistry, when you get to studying the atomic science, for example, you see an inherent functionality to the structure of the atom, for example. And somewhere along the line, you will get the feeling that, yeah, there's something here. I think I got the feeling, I think it was a moment of clarity in the middle of a lesson. I said, wait a minute, no. These things which we are studying, again, in a schematic manner, in a scientific manner, they obviously show, they display an intelligence which they do not seem to contain within their own physical bounds, within their own physical realms. So, and that's when I started more and more, not so much believing, but disbelieving this atheist thought that everything is chaos, everything is random. I guess I stopped believing in chaos and I started believing in functionality. And so, in that moment, I really started, I think my mind opened up to an idea that's called intelligent design. It's like usually used as a euphemism, mainly in North America, in regards to believing in God. Intelligent design, the belief that everything is designed in a functional and intelligent way, and therefore the assumption is that there's an intelligence behind it.
Yes.
Studying atomic science, the periodic table is very interesting. Have a look. I mean, it's just, yeah, I start getting the feeling that everything's really, really, really well designed, and it's across all fields. Not only all fields interlinked among themselves, but each field seems to have its very particular rules. And this really I think this really kind of paved the way for a very interesting trip into religion, when it's on functionality, intelligence, a higher form of intelligence, and laws at the end of the day, because law is very important in the field of religion, and so I think that's how it started.
Okay,
Yeah.
so that's how it started. So you now had reached the point where, as you said, maybe you hadn't believed in this deity or this supreme being as such.
Not yet. Yeah.
But at least you'd moved away from this concept of man came into being through an accident. That
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. I stopped disbelieving in accidents.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So you stopped believing in accidents. Alhamdulillah. That's a good way to put it. Okay, I must remember that one. So then what happened? I mean, did you then? I mean, I'm assuming, I could be wrong here. Did you then start thinking, because obviously your connection with religion would have been Christianity up until this point.
Yeah.
Did you then start thinking, well, maybe I need to re-explore my religion, and maybe I've not given it a fair hearing, maybe I need to approach it for a second time?
I think it didn't so much, I think it added to my understanding and perhaps to some of the ideas I had before, and perhaps gave them a bit more depth, but to be honest, I only really returned to, I mean, I was never really Catholic, but if you can call it Catholic roots, I will have returned there after converting to Islam. So after converting to Islam, I started reading the Bible, I started taking a lot of the message of the Catholic Church a lot more seriously. But after, I guess, that episode in the chemistry lesson, not at all. I think I kind of, because I was still very stubborn, essentially, and I still had very precise views of what the Catholic Church had to say, and so it didn't really, it's not a path that I would naturally taken, because the Catholic Church kind of, I think they concentrate around very particular notions which would not have helped me in my kind of trip to find where this intelligent design comes from, because I think the Catholic Church a lot of times they kind of sway they away from essential philosophical debates and
you just
talk
have
about
to believe, even though it doesn't make sense. You just have to believe it.
There's a lot of emphasis on blind faith. There's a lot of emphasis on bloody events regarding the life of Jesus, peace be upon him, and so it wasn't a natural path. It happened after. It wasn't a natural path, so I can say I kind of hit a stumbling block, even though obviously by no means did I stop observing things I would see in the world. Obviously I would keep thinking, and there was some kind of evolution still ongoing, but I think I was not really exposed to any kind of school of thought that would have
helped you on your journey.
Yeah, that would have helped me to really develop that at that point, I think.
So basically you had a sufficient enough understanding of Christianity to know that your your answer didn't lie in Christianity.
I think it's my answer. I think I had to go through somewhere else first.
Sure, and then come back to Christianity.
Absolutely, because I mean, mind you, something that's very, I mean, again, I wasn't, and still I'm not the most knowledgeable person in terms of Catholic dogma, but something that is quite prominent is this blurring of the line between Jesus, peace be upon him, and God. And this is something that's extremely confusing for when you are a young man. I mean, constantly being bombarded with all these symbols. In a Catholic country, you will be bombarded with, and different practices as well.
Yes.
Because because it's so broad and because there's so many things which are stated in such an ambiguous way, and because there isn't always a very good connection between the priest and the people, this really opens the way for all kind of, I mean, on one side there's blind faith and there's narrow-mindedness, on the other side there's all kinds of incomprehensible practices and ideas, and so it's not really so much like, it's not that I rejected it, it's just that it was still fresh in my mind. I think that kind of confusion, it was fresh in my mind, so it wasn't the obvious path to take to go towards clarity. I think it was more, I did go somewhere else, but I did come back to it later on.
Okay, we need to talk about that, because this going back to Christianity afterwards, I can definitely relate to, because it's something that I definitely did, and I felt that my, if you like, my connection to Jesus Christ, peace and blessing be upon him, after I became a Muslim, became so much stronger.
Absolutely.
So this is something that we need to maybe touch upon. Join us after the short break, where we will find out how Brother Joao actually became in contact, or came into contact with Islam for the first time, and the impressions that it had upon him. Join us soon. Assalamu alaikum.